Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to 31 Bligh Street for this event with the Lowy Institute's 2023 Distinguished Fellow for International Security, Professor Eliot Cohen. I'm Michael Fullilove, Executive Director of the Institute. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 7th of October, Hamas militants stormed across the border from Gaza into southern Israel. More than 1,200 Israelis were killed in the deadliest day in Israel's history and the largest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Several hundred were taken back to the Gaza Strip as hostages. In response, Israel launched full-scale ground operations into the Hamas-run territory, and the resulting conflict and destruction has roiled the region and the world. This war will have enormous implications for Israeli politics, for Middle East politics, and for global politics. And to discuss these issues, we're joined by the leading American military strategist, Professor Eliot Cohen. Eliot is a well-known scholar who served as Dean of SAIS at Johns Hopkins University until 2021. He's also been a senior policymaker, serving in government on several occasions, including as counsellor in the State Department in the last years of the George W. Bush administration. Eliot is currently the Robert E. Osgood Professor at SAIS, as well as the Arlie A. Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS. He writes widely on military affairs, American foreign policy, and leadership. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic, where his writings on Ukraine have been particularly powerful. His latest book, The Hollow Crown, Shakespeare on How Leaders Rise, Rule and Fall, was published in October. Eliot is in Australia as the Lowy Institute's 2023 Distinguished Fellow for International Security. This is a 3-year program supported by the Australian Department of Defence. In a moment, Eliot will deliver some remarks. He'll then join me on stage for a conversation about the war in Gaza and its implications for the world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eliot Cohen to the lectern.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for being here. I see some familiar faces in the audience. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Lowy Institute for its hospitality. So my subject is the Gaza war. As you heard, on October 7th, some 2,000 Hamas operatives attacked the Israel-Gaza border at 29 points. They breached the barrier, and after disabling many of the observation points, broke through, in some cases going over the wall around Gaza by paraglider. Following the breaches, they attacked a number of the collective settlements in the area and indeed attempted to penetrate further into Israel well beyond the immediate border. In what ensued, as you've heard, over 1,200 Israelis have been identified as having been killed. Just over 2/3 of them were civilians, including young people at an overnight music festival, women, children, and the elderly. Some of the killings involved beheadings and the use of thermobaric weapons in civilian houses. Some 240 people were abducted. Of those, in addition to some of the women killed in the kibbutzim, an indeterminate number were raped in what seems to have been a premeditated plan. Although the objective of the attack included some military bases, several of which were nearly occupied by the attackers, the main target of the attacks were the civilians. The proliferation of body cameras on the attackers suggests a desire to document these attacks, whether for internal morale purposes or psychological warfare is unclear. The objective of massacring the civilian populations of the kibbutzim and taking hostages was achieved, apparently beyond the expectations of the planners. The initial 2,000 attackers were reinforced by follow-on waves, some of them from Hamas, others possibly from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, some of them possibly just average Gazans. The attacks also began with the launching of 3,000 rockets from Gaza into Israel. As of November 24th, so before the ceasefire, which is now expired, about 10,500 had been fired, some fraction of which fell in Gaza proper. Total IDF casualties amount to some 400 dead, most of them killed on October 7th, and Israel as a whole has had over 9,000 wounded. Hamas authorities report some 15,000 dead and 36,000 wounded, again before the ceasefire, while Israel claims some 4,000 Hamas members killed in battle. In addition, the violence around Israel includes several hundred attacks by Hezbollah out of Lebanon on Israel's northern frontier, with a dozen Israelis and perhaps 100 Hezbollah operatives killed. Underreported violence on the West Bank includes something like half a dozen Israelis and several hundred Palestinians killed. There have been a number of long-range missile attacks from Yemen at Israel, as well as attacks on Israeli-owned commercial vessels and attacks on American naval and commercial vessels as well. There have been some 70 attacks on American outposts in Syria and Iraq, almost certainly conducted by Iranian-backed militias, with counterstrikes by American forces. The United States has taken about 60 wounded, thankfully none killed thus far. Now, I recite all this to make the point that this is a big war, and it's not over. And it has very large implications because of the way it has been waged, its objectives, and its potential to spread. The initial attack reflects a quite extraordinary level of planning by Hamas. That organization is best understood not simply as a terrorist organization, because I think that is in a certain way to underestimate them, but rather as an army of some 30,000 or more. Nomenclature, I think, is important here. It is an army because it is organized, disciplined, and trained like one. It is barbaric in its means and objectives, to be sure, but so is the Waffen-SS, and so is the Russian army. It does not fight with tanks and fast jets, but that's a matter of tools and techniques, not essence. Now, there are many aspects of this war that cry out for and will receive in due course close examination. But the immediate questions that I would like to address here are first, how did this happen? And secondly, what does it portend? So let me begin with the first question, surprise. The surprise of October 7th will go down in the history of such things as a case to be compared with 9/11, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Chinese entry into the Korean War, and Pearl Harbor. It is staggering to think that Israeli intelligence, as competent as it is, either did not warn or did not warn effectively of the impending attack. It is also incredible that IDF forces along the border were so poorly prepared for what happened. To begin unraveling that, let me quote from Roberta Wohlsteder's classic study of Pearl Harbor, Essence of Decision, in 1962. Warning and Decision, published in 1962, and specifically the introduction written by Thomas Schelling, a former professor of mine, one of the founders of game theory. So this is what Schelling writes. Surprise, when it happens to a government, is likely to be a complicated, diffuse, bureaucratic thing. It includes neglect of responsibility, but also responsibility so poorly defined or so ambiguously delegated that action gets lost. It includes gaps in intelligence, but also intelligence that, like a string of pearls too precious to wear, is too sensitive to give to those who need it. It includes the alarm that fails to work, but also the alarm that has gone off so often that it has been disconnected. It includes the unalert watchman, but also the one who knows he'll be chewed out by his superior if he gets higher authority out of bed. It includes the contingencies that occur to no one, but also those that everyone assumes somebody else is taking care of. It includes straightforward procrastination, but also decisions protracted by internal disagreement. It includes, in addition, the inability of individual human beings to rise to the occasion until they are sure it is the occasion, which is usually too late. Unlike movies, real life provides no musical background to tip us off to the climax. Finally, as at Pearl Harbor, surprise may include some measure of genuine novelty introduced by the enemy and possibly some sheer bad luck. Now, it does seem to be the case that Hamas training exercises for different parts of the plan were observed and reported. It appears, moreover, that concerns about these exercises were raised at different levels and in different ways in the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli Security Agency, the Shabak, and, as was recently reported in the New York Times, that some version of the Hamas plan was in the hands of Israeli intelligence. So what happened? Well, I think there are 4 large explanations out there. Let's begin with something that's been reported quite well in the Israeli press, that young soldiers charged with monitoring the Gaza Strip did indeed detect unusual levels of preparation and planning by Hamas. Most of these soldiers were young female conscripts whose job it is to monitor a particular patch of Gaza, and who within a couple of months become familiar with every wall, every rock, every normal pattern of behavior in their area of responsibility. In a number of cases, it is reported senior non-commissioned officers supported their claims, which were then dismissed or disregarded by more senior intelligence and operational commanders. Fact is that for all that Israel is an egalitarian society, that probably had a lot to do with the fact that the soldiers in question were young, female, and conscripts. In Israel, as in most militaries, and perhaps more than in most, soldiers, and above all officers in the combat branches, are very high prestige, and the result can be a caste system of relationships, and that may have happened here. By the way, some of these female soldiers were stationed forward and lost their lives in the subsequent attack. So one source of surprise then will probably turn out to have something to do with command climate in the IDF, or at least its Gaza division, and possibly in some other parts of the bureaucracy. A second explanation will probably turn out to have something to do, as it often does in such cases, with the negative consequences of genuine success. The Israelis have in recent years built an extensive barrier system around the Gaza Strip to include sensors intended to locate the tunnels that Hamas has long been trying to dig under the border into Israel. Sophisticated, remotely operated sensors of various kinds, including night vision, other electro-optical devices, and other kinds of sensors, and some remotely operated weapons were there as well. And of course, behind it all, you had the Israeli Iron Dome missile defense system. For limited purposes, it was a very successful approach. The problem was that Hamas found a different way to attack, as militaries often do. When sonar made it difficult for German U-boats to prosecute submerged attacks on convoys during World War II, they just began attacking on the surface instead. The Maginot Line was not a bad defensive system. It's just that the Germans managed to bypass it. And here too, Hamas decided to break through the barrier after neutralizing many of the sensors rather than tunnel under it. It will not be puzzling why Hamas chose the operational approach that it did. What will be puzzling is why the Israelis did not anticipate it. That very much includes why they did not have quick reaction forces on alert at all times. The answer will turn out, I suspect, to lie in the belief that they had figured out a way how to contain and tame Hamas, which leads to a third explanation. And that is the official belief or concept that they had contained the Gaza problem. A combination of intense periods of limited strikes, coupled with large subsidies from Qatar, authorized and indeed encouraged by Israel, together with opening the border to tens of thousands of workers from Gaza and allowing them to come to Israel, were supposed to have Hamas more or less where the Israelis wanted them. It is possible as well, and there's been some evidence to this effect given by Israeli security service personnel who interrogated Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip while he was in prison, that they believed that he and Hamas had in some way, to some extent, mellowed. That while they might dream of eliminating Israel, they were for the time being willing to live with it. It is even conceivable that they believed that Hamas would be tempered in its action by concern about what an all-out war with Israel would be like for the residents of Gaza. Parenthetically, I will note that Yahya Sinwar recently said that October 7th was, quote, a dress rehearsal, and, quote, we will do this again and again and again. Finally, most explosively, as I said, it's been reported by Israeli intelligence sources that the government was warned that Israel's internal political turmoil in recent months was making the country look weak and vulnerable. An alternative, perhaps more creditable explanation is the government was simply focusing on Iran and Hezbollah as security threats and simply took its eye off the ball. So these are, at the moment, just hypotheses. My guess is that they will turn out, however, to at least approximate the truth. What is most important from the immediate point of view, though, is to understand just how transformative these events will continue to be for Israeli strategy going forward. In the meanwhile, we can expect that, as after 1973 and 2006, a blue ribbon state commission of inquiry will be appointed, which will interrogate Israel's political, military, and intelligence leaders, and that the top echelons of the government, including the prime minister, will either be driven from office or resign of their own accords. Let me move now to talk about the Israeli response. Now, the Israeli reaction to the October 7th massacre was predictably intense. Even before the incursion on the ground, over a period of 3 weeks, Israel launched some 7,000 airstrikes, quite apart from artillery or missile attacks from air or sea. These were not indiscriminate attacks, but they undoubtedly killed a lot of civilians and damaged infrastructure. It is in the nature of military operations that direct engagement with the enemy adds new targets. As prisoners are interrogated, captured computers or documents are exploited, and new sensors are implanted or emplaced. So, unsurprisingly, as the war has resumed, it has done so at an equally intense pace. The land incursion, as we all know, sealed off the northern half of the Gaza Strip from west to east and along the shore. Only Gaza City has thus far been spared direct occupation, but that will soon end, I think. There isn't a whole lot usefully to be said about the ground incursion, other than that the Israelis seem to have done surprisingly well from a purely tactical point of view. To give you some perspective, the Second Battle of Fallujah in December 2004, and I was visiting with the United States 1st Marine Division in Ramadi, and actually went to Fallujah in between the first and second battles there. That attack against about 3,000 al-Qaeda in Iraq members, well dug in, but nothing like Hamas, cost about 100 American dead. The Israelis, in a much larger operation, have lost somewhat fewer than that. Note as well that the advantage we had in Fallujah is that we, too, got most of the population to leave, over 90% of the pre-war population of 300,000, and even so, well over 500 civilians died in the fighting. Urban warfare is a bloody business, something that is often forgotten. To give just one awful statistic, in 1 month of fighting during February 1945, the United States Army retook Manila from the Japanese. It was an entirely sympathetic civilian population. Some 100,000 civilians lost their lives in the Battle of Manila. Israel's tactical success against an enemy that had a lot more time to prepare than al-Qaeda did in Fallujah is probably a result of excellent intelligence preparation of the battlefield, appropriate technology, tactics, and training, and motivation as well. Let's not forget that last part. The IDF's biggest problem in the aftermath of October 7th was having overstrength reserve units, as some 200,000 Israelis rushed home to serve. But these are tactical matters. What is more important are the strategic challenges ahead. The first of these has to do with the ability of Israel to achieve the stated objective of destroying Hamas's military capacity and its ability to govern the Gaza Strip. It is very difficult to see how Israel can do that without inflicting far more civilian casualties than it has thus far. That in turn will have major political repercussions, including in the United States. It is uncertain how Israel can even begin attacking Khan Yunis and other areas in southern Gaza without inflicting those kinds of casualties. But even that issue pales in difficulty next to the second strategic issue: what happens with Gaza even if Hamas is rendered militarily impotent and unable to exercise political control over the local population? The hard fact is that nobody wants Gaza. Not Israel, not Egypt, not Saudi Arabia, not the United Arab Emirates, not the European Union, not the United States, not Australia, and not even the Palestinian Authority. And yet there will have to be some sort of solution to the basic governance of some 2 million impoverished people who will be consumed with multiple hatreds. Hatreds of Israel for the destruction they have suffered, but also hatred of Hamas for having invited all that by the action of October 7th. The final strategic issue is one that is insufficiently acknowledged in the West, and that is a shift in strategic culture and tone in Israel. For Israel, the existential issue is now on the table, and that changes everything. It is not that anyone thinks that Hamas could march on Tel Aviv, although they may have wished to penetrate as far as Beersheba. It is rather that the scope and surprise of this debacle has dealt Israel's strategic reputation a major blow. A critical tenet of Israeli strategic thinking is deterrence, and much of its behavior is explicable by a desire to maintain an image of strength and indeed ferocity that will prevent its enemies from taking advantage of its small size and advanced, and therefore to some extent fragile, economy, to weaken it by degrees. In other words, the current Israeli attacks on Hamas in Gaza has multiple audiences, two of the most important being in Beirut and Tehran. Yet the change goes deeper yet. It was possible for Israel to make a deal even with the PLO, even with Yasser Arafat, as painful and ultimately unfruitful as that turned out to be. Not with Hamas. When I was in government, I met with Meir Dagan, then head of the Mossad. In his office were two pictures, one of Israeli jets flying over Auschwitz, the other of his grandfather kneeling before being murdered by a Nazi guard. I guarantee you, there will be pictures of October 7th, comparable or indeed probably even worse in emotional impact, hanging in the offices of many intelligence officers and soldiers in Israel. It is the stuff of nightmares, and it will weigh particularly heavily on those responsible for Israel's security. And that is why so many of the analogies that have been drawn with the 1982 war, or with the Iraq war, or even more strangely with India's decision not to react to the Lashkar-e-Toiba attack on Mumbai in 2008, are profoundly misleading. The Israeli military will act towards Hamas the way it would act towards units of the SS if they were still around and within striking range. They will follow World War II rules, not the rules we followed in Iraq and Afghanistan, which still produced, by the way, many civilian casualties. And what that implies is that this war will go on for a very long time, and that it will include not merely a relentless months, maybe even years-long campaign against Hamas in Gaza, but a campaign of targeted killing abroad as well. All that's pretty grim. Let me step back a bit and say what I think some of the larger implications of this war are. We should begin by noting the things that haven't happened. In one of my favorite Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock Holmes points out the peculiar story of the dog in the middle of the night. And Watson says, well, the dog didn't bark. He said, that's the striking thing. What has not happened in this war is as interesting as the things that have happened. It is not clear how close we came to a much bigger Middle East war, and I think it's entirely possible that the American dispatch of 2 aircraft carriers off the coast of Lebanon had a lot to do with preventing that. That may still happen. There have been constant exchanges of fire along the border with Lebanon, but at the moment it's being conducted under the very strange but mutually very well understood rules of the game. No deep attacks in Israel, only shooting on both sides at military targets. Air raids in Syria up to a certain point are part of the game, and others. The dangerous moment would come, I think, if Hezbollah and Iran had thought that Israel was truly on the ropes and that they had an opportunity to land a really crippling blow. They have not believed that thus far. Furthermore, in this war, to an even greater extent than in 2006 and 2014, What is striking is the degree of tacit support for Israel that has been shown by the governments of the Arab states that are well disposed to it, chiefly Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. As someone who well remembers the 1973 Middle East War, the very idea that one would describe Egypt and Saudi Arabia as well disposed to Israel, by the way, is simply astounding. Wars can reveal underlying political truths. What the series of Gaza wars have revealed is that the states I've mentioned, and some others, hate and fear the Muslim Brotherhood as much as they hate and fear Hezbollah and Iran. And they fear all of them infinitely more than they fear the Israelis. None of these states has broken relations with Israel, and indeed all four in different ways seem to be quietly cooperating with it. In that respect, the Middle East has changed in quite dramatic ways. Having said that, however, the war has revealed that the conflict in the Middle East is now loosely coalitional in nature. On both sides, there are not alliances so much as uneasy partnerships. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was at pains to say that he knew nothing about the impending attack on Israel, which was purely a Palestinian operation. He is supportive of Hamas and has undoubtedly provided arms and training, but this is not a genuine alliance at work. Of course, nonetheless, Hezbollah has ramped up attacks on the border, and other Iranian surrogates, particularly the Houthis of Yemen, have begun their own attacks. These are parallel and coordinated, if not necessarily jointly planned operations. It's quite striking, for example, that during the ceasefire, attacks on American outposts in Iraq and Syria ceased. On the other side is Israel, the United States, and a number of European and Asian governments, although the position of some populations is less clear. In a more ominous development, Russia clearly, and China somewhat less so, have tilted to Hamas for reasons of their own. This is also a full spectrum war. That is to say, it involves terror, conventional infantry warfare in an urban setting, strategic bombing, and above all, a strategic information and disinformation campaign. And the Israelis, as in the past, find themselves at a disadvantage in that last regard. What is striking that although they do try to engage in what Chinese theorists have referred to as cognitive warfare, the Israelis are well behind in it. They realize that it is inevitable that Palestinian suffering in Gaza will get more media play than their view, and they are resigned to it. But there's a difference, a big difference, between losing that dimension of the conflict 90-10 and losing it 60-40. It is an asymmetry that liberal democracies have wrestled with in the past and will wrestle with in the future. Their opponents, be it al-Qaeda in Iraq or the Taliban or Hamas or Russia or China, have advantages in distorting the truth and coercing the press that is difficult for the Israelis or countries like the United States or Australia to make up. In a week or so, I'll be going to Israel. In the past year, I have visited Ukraine and Taiwan. And I have to say that it seems to me that these conflicts are linked. And this is the large point on which I want to conclude. Some of the protagonists are the same. It is no coincidence, I think, that you find Russia tilting to Hamas, fighting Ukraine, and supporting China over Taiwan. It is no coincidence that the United States and its key allies are all more or less on the other side. You, may not be fighting terrorists who have a deeply constructed network of tunnels built up over many years in a densely packed urban area. But you may very well find yourselves up against people who are quite willing to use civilians as human shields and who will relentlessly distort and misrepresent the truth about what your armed forces do. You will unquestionably face opponents who will try to pry you apart as far as possible from the United States, invoking both of these wars and the potential for a third. Winston Churchill captured an essential truth in his biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. Battles, he wrote, are the principal milestones in secular history. Modern opinion resents this uninspiring truth, and historians often treat the decisions of the field as incidents in the dramas of politics and diplomacy. But great battles, won or lost, change the entire course of events, create new standards of values, new moods, new atmospheres in armies and in nations, to which all must conform. Wars are, whether we like it or not, the hinges of history, and we're at one now. Liberal democracy has not been under such pressure, externally and I'm afraid internally, since the 1930s. Some of the same questions arise now that arose then. Are we willing to tolerate a world in which there are no rules, in which the deliberate use of terror is routine, and in which civilians become legitimate targets for kidnapping, torture, and public beheading? Are our governments able to handle crises in multiple theaters simultaneously? Is our confidence in liberal democratic values strong enough to enable us, on the one hand, to remain who we are, but to mobilize the resources and have the will to do the things we have to do to protect ourselves? Most importantly, do we have the means, intellectual as well as physical, to thwart or defeat states that are out not only to eliminate neighboring liberal democracies, but to transform the international order? To conclude, let me put this in the largest possible frame. In my study at home, I have Zara Steiner's magnificent 2-volume history of international relations in the 1920s and 1930s. The first volume is called The Light That Failed. The second, The Triumph of the Dark. History never repeats itself, but we would be foolish to react weakly to what is happening in Gaza, or Ukraine, or Taiwan, as the politicians of the 1930s were to react with feeble and meaningless condemnation and inept sanctions to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, or Germany's occupation of the Rhineland in 1936, or the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. The light has not yet failed and the darkness has not yet triumphed. But I submit that it can, and it will, if we do not learn from what is unfolding before our very eyes. Thank you very much.
Eliot, thank you for very substantive and forceful remarks, and thank you for agreeing to take our questions. I'm only going to ask a couple of questions. I know there are a lot of people who are keen to direct questions at you. Let me go, first of all, to where you started, and that is the reasons for the surprise, and you suggested a number of explanations for those. One of your possible explanations for surprise, and I quote, was the government was warned by intelligence agencies that Israel's internal political turmoil in recent months was making the country look weak and vulnerable. You didn't spend a lot of time on that. You described it as explosive, I think. But it's certainly one that people have discussed, the so-called judicial reforms, the constitution of the Netanyahu cabinet with far right-wing members. Talk a bit about that. What sort of explanatory weight do you think that has?
Well, I think it's, with all these things, you have to treat them as hypotheses until you really have data. And the data you would need would have to do with internal deliberations by the leaders of Hamas, which you may or may not at some point come across. I mean, that's, we sometimes do have come across the things that Al-Qaeda was thinking about, or ISIS, or similar organizations. But I think Hamas did believe that first, that the Israelis were distracted, but secondly, that the society was weak. And in that respect, I think that, what I find fascinating is, I think Hamas understood some part of the Israelis extremely well, and other parts not at all. So there was a great interview in the Financial Times with one of the interrogators who had interrogated Yahya Sinwar when he was in a prison. So Sinwar became completely fluent in Hebrew. He was reading biographies of Israeli leaders. And as this interrogator said, we thought we understood him, but he was going to school on us. But my guess is that Sinwar, like anybody who's that committed to a cause, was capable both in some areas of deep understanding and in other areas of real blindness. You could say the same thing. I mean, you should always be careful with the comparisons with Hitler, but I think in this case it's apt. Hitler had some brilliant insights into who he was dealing with. And then in other respects, he had zero insights into who he was dealing with. And you really see that in what he says after the Munich conference. He says, I've met my opponents, they're worms. Well, I mean, in one way, he had a point. Another way, he completely misjudged, I think, particularly what the Brits would turn out to be. I think there's something probably somewhat similar here. And I think they may have been, one of the things that was quite striking about the Israeli response is that these civic action groups, which have been organizing these really big demonstrations day in, day out, week after week in Tel Aviv, immediately repurposed themselves to, first getting supplies and equipment to the IDF, but also things like, going to work on farms where they had to bring in the harvest, arranging schools the Israelis have about 125,000 displaced persons, to doing all those things. It just turned on a dime. And I'm not sure that Sinwar would have expected that. I think his own framework was in some ways limited. But I think this, let me just emphasize this, because I think it's a point which has larger significance. And it has merit, I think, when we think about potential opponents, whether it's somebody like Vladimir Putin or even somebody like Xi Jinping, and I'll defer to Richard McGregor on all things Xi Jinping. You can be dealing with people who have tremendous but very limited insight, or very narrow insight, which can be quite dangerous, because then they can make decisions on the basis of genuine insights, which are, however, too narrow.
Let me ask you one more question about the surprise. You spoke at length about some of Israel's intelligence failures. You mentioned this remarkable article in the New York Times that it appears that the Israeli military had obtained Hamas's battle plan for the attack over a year before it occurred. And Hamas did seem to follow this plan nearly to the letter. Talk a bit about that, if you can.
So obviously, I haven't seen the plan. The New York Times story said it's like about 40 pages, and that, by the way these things usually work is Israeli journalists get this stuff. They would run afoul of their country's secrecy laws if they published it themselves in one of the Israeli newspapers, so they give it to an friendly American journalist, and the Americans run it, and then they can report that the Americans have reported that. It's a very Israeli thing. So, I mean, that's pretty explosive. And what the article said was that senior leaders dismissed this as aspirational. And I can believe that. It speaks to me of a couple of things. One is the power of having a concept. I mean, this is very much in the Israeli literature about the 73 war. They talk about, in the advance of the war, the conceptia, the concept, which was not whether or not the Egyptians would attack, but when they thought their window to do it was, which was going to be several years later in 75 or a little bit later after they had various pieces in place. So my guess is that part of what you have here is the power of having a concept. By the way, to a lesser extent, but still damagingly, we had a concept about the Russian military and a concept about the Ukrainian military. We tracked, like the Israelis, we saw everything. We did, I think the United States did anticipate that the Russians would attack, but we had a concept about how good the Russian army was. We had a concept about Ukrainian will to fight. And that caused us to really make some very major misjudgments. Now, the blood that was spilled as a result of that was Ukrainian, not American. So we haven't reacted as powerfully to that. The other thing is, I remember when I was in government, I would get every week, the threat matrix, which was just, okay, here are all the big terror plots that are going on. And for the first few weeks, I couldn't sleep after reading those things. And then after a while, you realize, okay, most of these are never going to happen. Most of these are aspirational. Most of these are going to get frustrated. And so depending on what other stuff there was in the system, it may be a bit more explicable. And that's why I think you've got to be careful not to overreact to a single news story, even if the news story is completely accurate, which I'm willing to believe it is, because you need to know the full context of what people are in the system are reading. And that's why it's going to take quite a while, I think, to figure this one out.
All right. You said the IDF has performed surprisingly well from a purely tactical point of view, but you pointed to a huge strategic challenge looming, and that is what happens in Gaza after the war. So say that Israel succeeds in destroying Hamas or degrading it to the point that it can't govern Gaza, which itself is an extremely ambitious war aim. Say that happens, though. Who steps in? You said the hard fact is that nobody wants Gaza, and you mentioned lots of entities that don't want Gaza, but Gaza is there.
Right.
Gazans are there. Millions of people are there. Who's the most likely candidate? Who would be the best candidate?
So I think what some Israelis have, and this is one thing I'll be very curious to find out about when I go over there. I think the idea that some Israelis have floated is a kind of transitional authority of some sort, which hopefully would be around for a while, in which the leading players would be Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and maybe Egypt. And I think that probably would be the best, because what you would need would be governments who are involved who really don't want to see Hamas grow back, who would view that as a very dangerous thing. It's better if it's not Israelis. It's certainly better if it's not Americans or Australians. And so I think that would be the optimal thing. Now, whether those states have the appetite to do that and whether they have the organizational capacity to do that, that's a very different thing, I think.
All right, let me ask one more question before going to the audience about the regional implications. Clearly, one motivation behind the attack on the 7th of October was to derail the negotiations to normalise relations.
I'm not sure we have evidence of that.
Okay. All right. Let me put a hypothesis to you. One of the motivations was to derail the negotiations to normalise relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia within the framework of a US-Saudi security pact. Those negotiations are now paused, but the reporting is the Saudis remain interested. Do you see a fundamental logic to normalisation?
So first, there is a powerful logic to normalization, but I do want to engage with you on the first thing you said. I think, and this goes to, again, a problem that we face. This is why I think this war has broader relevance. You know, I was at the Munich Security Conference just before Putin invaded. And I remember talking to many, many knowledgeable Europeans, politicians, military people, intelligence people about Putin's motives, just grab a little piece here, a little piece there, bluff, limited objectives. Actually, the truth is he wanted to destroy Ukraine and occupy it and, kill off the leadership and incorporate it into Russia because he doesn't think Ukraine's a real country. That was right out in the open for us to see. He had written this, scary article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and we didn't take it seriously. And I think the problem is that we tend to apply our conception of war to some of the adversaries that we're dealing with. And it would be entirely logical from an American or Australian or European sort of strategic point of view, say, okay, we have a limited objective here, we want to just derail those negotiations, as opposed to saying, no, he really wants to set up the preconditions for the destruction of the state of Israel. And that's, I think you're much more likely to get at the truth of it if you accept that he believes the things he says. I mean, we get ourselves into very big trouble, I think, very frequently when we refuse to believe the things that people say. And we've gotten into, and that again, I think the parallels with the 30s are disturbing.
All right, let me take some questions. I saw Alan Dupont's hand up. If you can just wait for the microphone, and please, we're looking for short questions rather than statements of any length. Alan.
Eliot, thanks very much. Alan Dupont from the Lowy Institute. I'd like to draw out just a little bit more, please, on your comment about the implications of the Gaza conflict for the capacity of liberal democracies to defend themselves. So the main point I would really throw at you, or the point I wanted to make, was that we don't tend to take a holistic view about fighting wars and winning wars. We don't have, by and large, political strategies. And we all know that the purpose of military conflict is always political strategic. So looking at the way in which Hamas have manipulated the information domain to their advantage, what can we take away from that, for example, in Australia? What do we need to do in terms of our capacity to defend our liberal democracies more broadly than just sort of kinetic effects, defence, getting more tanks or more aircraft or whatever?
Well, it's in ways like dealing with alcoholism. You first need to recognize that you got a problem, which is frequently the biggest hurdle to get over, to realize that this is actually a very serious issue and it's not something to be complacent about. So I spent 34 years teaching at a university whose motto is Veritas vos liberabit, the truth will make you free. And I think the first thing you have to do is really believe that that's the case and that the critical thing is the battle for the truth. Again, if you think back to World War II, I think part of what was, and to the Cold War as well, part of what was very effective about the kinds of things that the BBC did or the Voice of America did, or Radio Free Europe and all the rest did, was to make sure that they were getting the truth out there. Now, it's a much more challenging world. It's a much more challenging environment in the era of TikTok. And in a world where people are getting their information in kind of visual bits and pieces. But if you think it's really serious, you put effort into it. So that's one thing. The second thing is, and this one I feel universities have dropped the ball. You need to have and it's not just universities, it's secondary education. You really do need to teach people how to be citizens. And part of being citizens is being able to think critically about news and about political people. And I think we've, in large measure, failed at that. When I look at the quality of public discourse, certainly in my country, but I think in many countries, it's very disappointing. So, that's just obviously the preliminaries. But as I said, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. The first thing is to recognize you've got a serious problem. We have one of the things that's concerning is we have very serious vulnerabilities to countries like China and even to countries like Russia. It is easy for them to get inside our system. And Australians recognize that. We've begun to recognize it. But the fact to recognize it, while very important, that's just the beginning of dealing with the problem.
Let me go to Paul Kelly from The Australian.
Eliot, thanks so much for your comments. I'd like to take you back to Israel's objectives in Gaza. We know there are 3 or 4 or 5 central objectives, but they relate to eliminating Hamas as a military force and in terms of its political control of Gaza. Do you think that objective is realisable within the political tolerance required in terms of civilian casualties?
Well, that's good to see you, Paul. That's the big question, and I wouldn't claim to have an answer on that. I would add, restoring deterrence is actually a critical part of. That's a critical objective for the Israelis, because as bad as Hamas is, Hezbollah poses an even greater threat with somewhere between 150,000, 200,000 rockets which are bigger, more precise, longer range than what Hamas had. I mean, if Hezbollah ever unleashed that, there would be devastation in Haifa and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So for the Israelis, maintaining deterrence is in some ways even more important. I can imagine them being able to, not eliminate every last member of Hamas, but to disable it. I think that already has sort of happened in the northern Gaza Strip. I mean, there have been some indications that the Hamas chain of command, the kind of middle levels of leadership have been taken out, and so it's not really under their control. The question is what kind of tolerance you have in the United States. It's the United States that really matters in this one. I don't think it matters, other countries matter to the Israelis as much. And I think there is long-term tolerance as long as it's not egregious. So I don't think the Israelis can do what they did. The level of violence that was used in northern Gaza, I think that would be tough for the United States to sustain. But something a bit less than that, I think, is actually, that's going to be sustainable. The other thing, and again, this is all a provisional view. I think, the critical thing is that the Israeli frame of mind now is it is different than anything I've ever seen. And it's as if, I've mentioned this to several of the people here, it's as if, you're in one of those really kind of junky movies. We're on December 6th, 1941, the USS Nimitz, goes through some time warp, and all of a sudden they're there and they can intercept the Japanese fleet steaming to Pearl Harbor. Well, for the Israelis, this is, it's no kidding. Their mindset is they're dealing with the Einsatzgruppe and the Waffen-SS. That's what they're dealing with. And so, if you can put yourself into that mindset, you'll realize that they may not be thinking in the same mode that I would think, or that, Australian strategists would think about means and ends. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that that's a psychological reality, and it's a psychological reality that you don't talk people out of because it's existential.
General Mick Ryan, you just wait for a mic, Mick.
Thanks. Good to see you again, Eliot. It's been a long time.
Right, long time no see, Mick.
I want to ask a question about will, because every newspaper article we see is more about technology and numbers, whereas for me, what we're seeing is national will being harnessed in a way that many democracies haven't for generations. I mean, in my last visit to Ukraine, several senior officers said we didn't understand how deeply most Ukrainians felt about their sovereignty and the will that would be expressed post-February 2022. You go to Taiwan, senior people there say our big lesson is that if we don't demonstrate the will to defend ourselves, no one will help us. We've seen Israeli will demonstrated. Is part of the problem with our political discourse the fact that current politicians don't understand, don't have the capacity to leverage or persuade their populations to employ that kind of focused, profound will that's necessary to invest in the deterrence or indeed warfighting capacity that might be needed to deter Russia and China?
Yeah, well, I think it's even worse. We almost don't understand what it's like, and I think that causes a lot of misinterpretation of what's going on. We find it very hard, I think, to imagine what it's like. So I was doing some of the arithmetic on this. So the equivalent for what the Israelis have gone through would be you wake up one day and 4,000 Australians have been killed, and maybe 10,000 have been wounded, and maybe 800 have been taken hostage, and with the rapes and all that stuff. And this has all happened to people who were, actually like 50 miles away from each of your urban centers. And Australians would go nuts if that happened. That's not to say that you approve of anything that anybody's doing, just saying it's the empathetic ability to imagine what it's like to be in those circumstances. In the Israeli case, there are a number of things that are very striking. If you look at the way they've conducted the hostage return negotiations, they've taken a very tough line. This is not the Israel that exchanged about 1,000 prisoners for Gilad Shalit. They were quite constrained about it, and when Hamas began playing games, the war's back on. And for anybody who knows Israel, this is extraordinarily difficult because you've got, you know that the hostages are going through terrible things. Hamas has deliberately told you that they're going through terrible things. You know that the longer the war goes on, the less the chance that they will come back alive. And yet still they're willing to do it. That's a level of societal will that even goes beyond people being mobilized. But, it goes beyond that. I mean, if you look at, again, who's bringing in the harvest, it's like, a friend of mine who's a 70-year-old dentist is out there picking tomatoes to help get the harvest in. And there's lots and lots of that's going on. Unfortunately, I don't think that will, you're not going to have that sense of motivation until something terrible happens. When it happened to my country after 9/11, it faded over time, understandably. But, I remember what the first 6 months to a year after 9/11 were like in the US. And I think that's true elsewhere as well. The most you can do is, to try to get the political and military leadership to develop empathy. It doesn't have to be sympathy, but empathy with what that means.
Eliot, I'm going to ask you the last question.
Yep.
And I want to ask you about the note that you finished your speech on the big global issues. You've spoken about very somber topics today, but let me ask you, what are the reasons for optimism when you look at the international order? I mean, I would say, for example, another hypothesis that Russia and China have revealed the frailties of their decision-making processes in the last couple of years, their ability to make big mistakes, their difficulty in course correcting. We've seen countries withstand invasion. We've seen democracies actually be pretty stalwart in supporting Ukraine. We've seen the connections between like-minded countries quickening. When you look for reasons that the dark may not in fact triumph, where do you settle?
Well, I think you just gave a number of them. I mean, the response to the invasion of Ukraine, although I think it continues to be too little and with not enough urgency, and I could give an extended critique, and we could give even more of a critique. Still, it is better than you would have expected. But look, I also have. We haven't even talked about Donald Trump. I remember. Let me give you some of the answer that I gave my students literally the day after the 2016 election. Because the School of Advanced International Studies at Hopkins, somebody once said we should have a sweatshirts made up, which in the front say Johns Hopkins SAIS, and in the back say Deep State U, which in some ways we are, because the students are all over the place. We've even infiltrated the Australian military. And so they said, how will we process this, Professor Cohen? They're shocked. So I said, I'll give you two answers. One is, very famously, after the Constitutional Convention, which was held in secret, Benjamin Franklin, who's quite old and frail, is carried out on a sedan chair, and the population around him says, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And his response is, a republic, if you can keep it. And I think the point there is, liberal democracy is always frail, or it's always in danger. It's always can fall apart. It's, Ronald Reagan said liberty is always a generation away from extinction. I believe those things. So that's not new. And then the other thing I said is my mother just passed away the year before. And I said, as I thought about her life, so she lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the early Cold War, urban riots, and Vietnam. And then I thought about my grandparents, all of whom I knew quite well, and they lived through all those things, and in addition to that, pogroms, World War I, and the great influenza pandemic. And I said, I think about that, and I said, well, who says we get it easy? So, I think the lesson is, It is perilous, but it doesn't mean that you can't deal with it. You can. But that's why, in a way to go back to your question, Alan, it's really critical to have an engaged citizenry that thinks about such things and is aware of such things and understands that the world that you've got now, however comfortable it is not guaranteed to you. And you have to be willing to do the kinds of things that are necessary to protect it.
Well, Eliot, I was worried there because I asked you for reasons for optimism and you went to Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, there's that.
But then you came to Ben Franklin and a really important conclusion. So thank you very much. Let me apologise to those who tried to get questions in. There were a lot of hands today. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of you. But I do want to thank you, Eliot, for speaking to us, for taking our questions. As the Distinguished Fellow this year, Eliot was in Melbourne last week talking about Ukraine. He's heading to Canberra next to speak about other security challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Eliot Cohen. Thank you.